interested in getting in, I shall turn the meeting over to Dr. Carnig Thomason, who will moderate this panel and who will introduce the speakers.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to introduce to you tonight these distinguished Harvard professors who will conduct this panel discussion with me. First speaker this evening, first I think, can everyone hear me? If you all can hear me, I'd rather speak without the microphone. Because we are going to conduct this meeting in an informal manner. Did you want to make a recording of this? I mean, can you make it all right this manner, or do you speak?
Just put the mic on the floor.
Will it? First, I would like to have the privilege of introducing the speakers, and then we will ask each one of them to speak for a few minutes. On my right, I would first like to introduce Dr. Richard Frye. Dr. Frye is the Aga Khan Professor of Iranian Studies. He is the first professor to occupy this chair. On my left, Dr. Lawrence Jones. Dr. Jones is the Assistant Dean of the Graduate School of the Arts and Sciences. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with our friend Dr. Sanjian. Dr. Sanjian is the fellow in the field of Armenian Studies at Harvard. The middle gentleman on my right is Dr. Richard Pipes. Dr. Pipes is Associate Professor of History and Research Fellow at the Russian Research Center. On my far right is Dr. Sir Hamilton Gibb. Sir Hamilton is University Professor and holds a Jewett Chair in Arabic at Harvard University. Dr. Gibbs and all these gentlemen, in fact, have a very long list of qualifications, and I'm sure they wouldn't want me to burden you with their qualifications. But Dr. Gibbs pleases me very much, as being an old soldier myself. He's a Chevalier of the French Legion of Honor. He's a Knight Bachelor of the United Kingdom and a Commander of the Order of Orange-Nassau in Holland. I'm sure we're very fortunate to have these distinguished gentlemen with us this evening, and I'm going to ask each one of them to spend 5 or 10 minutes telling you about this new, exciting Harvard chair. The first one I'd like to call on is our friend, Professor Frye. Dr. Frye, would you kindly say a few words?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Having just come back from a year abroad, I'm rather new at what has been going on, or rather uninformed about what has been going on in NAASR and also in the university. But what I should like to just, in the very few minutes which I have to speak this evening, is just to say give a few general remarks about Armenian studies and the university and Harvard. Because some people have asked me, well, in Europe, as a matter of fact, what are you going to do at Harvard with the chair of Armenian studies? Really, is it that important? And do you really have any problems in this field, any work to do? Well, my answer to that is that it's the responsibility of the Armenians that they got themselves in a geographical situation in which they are not only of interest to themselves, but to neighbors on all sides, far and wide. That Armenian studies cannot and are not isolated. The Armenians in their history, and it's a long history going back to the beginning of written records almost, have been in contact with various peoples on the right and on the left, on the north and on the south. And therefore, the study of Armenian is part of a vast area, the area, as a matter of fact, in which our history began. And that from the very earliest days, it's from the entry of the people who were called Ike into the land which is Armenia, right from this time when they had contacts with the Hittites and with the Assyrians and with the people of Urartu and so on, have right on down to the present time, not only a nucleus of Armenian history, but a tremendous influence outside. So therefore, anyone who does work in the Armenian field, whether it be in linguistics, in the history of religion, in straight history, in art, architecture, or literature, or general thought, he has to be conversant with the cultures which surround Armenia. And vice versa. A person concerned with the Iranian field also has to be concerned with Armenia. That's why I am. Or a person concerned with the expansion of Islam, the history of Islam, must also take an interest in this. The people in our divinity school are interested in the First Kingdom, which accepted Christianity. And would like to know, for instance, why their neighbors on the north, the Albanians and the Georgians, did not accept the same brand of Christianity as the Armenians. I mean, these are little facts that we all know, but the reasons behind them have hardly been investigated, hardly have been searched. I have mentioned here before the fact that we have very, very few critical editions of Armenian classical texts in the modern sense of the word of what a critical edition is. This is just in the field of Armenian studies itself, literature and language. What must we know with the history of the church in Armenia? Not only the history of the church in Armenia, but the relations which the Armenians had with Cappadocia, the relations which they had with their neighbors, the Georgians to the north, the Syrians to the south. In short, the picture of Armenia, the picture of Armenian studies in a university, in Harvard, if you will, cannot be a simple question of studying the language or the literature of Armenia. It is a much wider question, a vaster question, if you will, a problem which is joined with other problems and which there is no end of the amount of work that needs to be done in it. And the university, like Harvard, has, I think, as its first duty, the honest investigation of sources, of material, in trying to ascertain the truth. This is not an easy task. It requires a great amount of preparation. It requires, for a person, that is, who is working in the Armenian field, it requires a knowledge which transcends also the limits, shall we say, of Armenia. It is also something, naturally, this investigation of Armenia, the past of Armenia, and its relations to other cultures and other peoples. I, at least, envision this as the greatest contribution to which a chair at Harvard can contribute. The teaching end of it will naturally flow from the breaking of new frontiers in knowledge on the part of people who are connected with Armenian studies at Harvard. The teaching will be enriched by the breaking of new frontiers in knowledge. And I think it is essential that one look rather with a priority, if you will, to this first task, because the other tasks will flow from this. This is of the prime importance, and this is the thing on which one must concentrate. And this is the banner, I should say, under which the other activities of Armenian studies, which you may have in your minds, questions and the like, I think will more or less automatically follow. If this is kept in mind, the vista, the problems of scholarship in this field can't even be touched tonight. They are so immense and so many of them that one could even be discouraged. But this, of course, we should never be. In short, I think that the establishment of a chair at Harvard, the development of a program in Armenian studies, is long overdue, and that the task must be of the highest scholarly level right from the start, and I think from the past history of Harvard you may be assured that it will. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Frye. I would now like to ask Dean Jones to be kind enough to say a few words. Dean Jones.
I have been asked to speak to you on the general problem of how Harvard University fills a chair. I wish it were a simple matter of saying that the president of the university finds someone with a broad academic background, so to speak, and lets him sit in the chair. But things are not quite that simple. Professor Frye has already pointed out to you some of the uses to which a professor of Armenian could be put. That is, the needs in history, in theology, in linguistics, which incidentally is my field. As a linguist, I would welcome an Armenian professor to teach the Armenian language to our linguistic students. Now, there is no unique way, I think, in which Harvard fills a professorial chair. However, I think that the usual way would be put into operation in the case of the Armenian chair. That is, a body of, or a committee of qualified scholars would be formalized through the dean of the faculty and the president to survey the entire world, if necessary, to find the best Armenian scholar they could find. Harvard University wants the best scholar in every field which it can find for a number of reasons. Harvard is a large institution. The man who fills this chair is not going to be merely a teacher. He must be actively engaged in research. He must work with men in various borderline fields. In the case of this Armenian professor, I know of a number of fields at the university which are crying for work to be done in this area, in their own discipline, so to speak. This committee would search the entire world, if necessary, to find the best scholar or a group of scholars which they would recommend as a candidate for the chair. Then an ad hoc committee would be appointed. This committee, differing slightly from the other, would be made up of faculty members from the university within the man's field and outside of the man's field, interested fields outside of Armenian studies. In addition to that, it would also contain faculty members from other institutions within and outside of the Armenian field. And the candidates for the chair would be discussed at great length in the presence of the president of the university and the dean of the faculty. They also would undoubtedly, if necessary, bring in what they call witnesses to talk about this man or these men and list the person's qualifications, his work, the work which he has accomplished in the field, his reputation, his zeal as a scholar. After this had been done, the president and dean of the faculty, as I understand it, would make a decision regarding the professor. If he is accepted, then his name is given to the board of overseers and this is passed. Now, I want to emphasize the fact that this is a very serious decision. The process of choosing an incumbent for a chair at Harvard is perhaps one of the most serious activities that the top administrators face. They realize this. And therefore, the whole process is gone about very carefully, and sometimes it is quite time-consuming. I think that's all I have to say now. Thank you.
Thank you very kindly. Thank you very kindly, Dean Jones. I'm sure I wouldn't like to be one of the men responsible for picking a Harvard professor. Our next speaker is our friend, Dr. Avedis Sanjian. Dr. Sanjian, would you kindly say a few words?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have been asked by the moderator to summarize, as it were, within the limits of 5 minutes, an experience that lasted for 5 months. That is, to say a few words about my trip last year abroad to centers of Armenian learning, libraries, and other institutions engaged in the study of this particular field. And I hope you will agree with me that it is not an easy task. I have on other occasions given certain talks expressing my views, reporting my findings regarding the activities within this particular area of scholarship. I must at first express my gratitude to the university, to Sir Hamilton particularly, for making it possible for me to go on such an extensive trip abroad. The major and primary purpose of my trip was, of course, to do some additional research on the project that I have been working on for the past few years. But I was fortunate in also being able to do some activity which has very close bearing on the activity with which you, members of the organization, and the administration and faculty at Harvard are actively engaged in. My task was also, the incidental task as it were, was to find out what work had been done in various centers in Europe and the Soviet Union within the Armenian field. The institutions which I visited in Europe were limited in number, simply because the institutions that do have centers of Armenian learning or offer courses in the field of Armenian are limited. I was able to find 3 institutions which have programs of Armenian studies, namely the School of Oriental and African Studies at London University, the École Nationale in Paris, and the University of Louvain in Belgium. Each of these centers of Armenian learning have had a history of their own, the oldest being that of the École Nationale in Paris, which is 150 years old. And some very outstanding Armenologists, mostly French, have occupied that chair. The work being done in London is relatively new and conducted by a young Englishman. The program at Louvain is directed primarily towards students of religion. What interested me more than any other institution in Europe was the Methodist congregation, first established in Venice in the beginning of the 18th century, and followed by an offshoot of the same congregation in Vienna. Now, these institutions have had a tradition lasting for over 2.5 centuries in this field of scholarship. I need not,
on this occasion, talk at length about the type of scholarship that some very outstanding scholars, both at Venice and Vienna, have produced. To my knowledge, scholarship per se, within the field of Armenian scholarship, was developed until recent times by the Mkhitaryists. And for that reason, those of us who are interested in the field have a great debt of gratitude. The unfortunate thing, however, is that within the past 30 or even 50 years, that tradition has been unfortunately dying out. There are a number of reasons why this is so. I shall not get into that tonight, but some of them seem to be rather obvious. The congregation is having difficulty recruiting candidates for the institution of the Catholic clergy to begin with. And if that major difficulty is there, scholarship naturally would be secondary in their considerations. I do not want to be misunderstood, however. I think they're still doing a substantial amount of scholarly work in the field of Armenian, both at Venice and Vienna. However, I'm inclined to compare the present work with the past work, which has had a very grand tradition. The next stop was the Soviet Union, and Soviet Armenia in particular. It is natural to expect that the major center of Armenian learning is at the present time in the capital of Armenia. And that is so because for the first time in the entire history of the Armenian people, the Armenians have a university of their own. Besides, they have scores of institutes under the auspices and jurisdiction of the Academy of Sciences, some of which concentrate solely on various aspects of Armenian scholarship. I could talk at great length about the amount of work that is being done in each of these institutes. But briefly, I might say that what I discovered in Soviet Armenia, insofar as Armenian studies were concerned, was beyond imagination. The university has been successful in training a large number of students who can carry out scholarly activities in history, literature, linguistics, and other humanistic studies. The number of scholars is unlimited. To give you an example, for instance, I had an appointment to see the director of the Institute of Linguistics. And when I walked into his office, I was met by some 25 old and very young linguists. The question is, however, what type of scholarship is being developed within the scope of the university and the institutes? This is a rather question, I think, for regardless of the extensive basic research being done in various aspects of Armenian culture, and regardless of the excellence of the quality of a number of scholarly works, there are certain obvious limitations about which I'm sure Professor Pipes will probably make a few comments. Now, these deficiencies, as it were, are basically ideological. And since ideology is a dominating factor, some of the excellent scholarly works are marred by certain obvious defects. What do we do from here on then, when this is the picture of Armenian scholarship throughout the world as I see it? The chairman of the board and other members of this association have talked at great length about the future possibilities of such a program at Harvard and other American universities. And I am sure Sir Hamilton Gibb, the director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, will have a great deal more to say about the kind of work that this institution expects to do in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sun. Now I'd like to call on Professor Frye to say a few words. Professor Frye.
Well, first of all, I must disclaim an expertise in the field of Armenian studies. I'm a Russian historian, not an Armenian or even a Middle Eastern specialist. But this perhaps goes on to support what Mr. Frye had said of the breadth of interests which Armenian studies offer, that even a Russian specialist, in one way or another, does get involved in Armenian studies and is interested in them. As you probably know, Russian connections with Armenia began very early, partly because of Russia's interest in expanding toward the Caspian and Black Seas, and partly because, from the point of view of Armenia, after the Muslim conquest, Russia represented the nearest great Christian power. Hence, from very early times, close amicable relations developed between Russia and Armenia, relations which at the beginning of the 18th century led to the passing on the part of the Russians of very special legislation designed to encourage Armenian migration into Russia. And beginning with the reign of Peter I, Armenian colonies were established, first in the south of Russia and then in the Russian cities in the north. Then, at the beginning of the 19th century, with Russia's expansion into the Caucasus, a very large number of Armenians came under Russian suzerainty. So that today, the Soviet Union has probably the largest concentration of Armenians in the world, and as Mr. Sanjian pointed out, is also the center of Armenian cultural activity. This then represents a great link between Russian history and Armenian history. From the point of view of the Russian historians, there are many problems of Armenian history which are highly interesting. I will just mention a few in passing. Armenian early chronicles throw a very interesting light on Russian history and Kievan history in the very early medieval period. It would be very interesting for a person who is competent to use these materials to provide the results of his findings to the Russian specialists. So far, the field, with some exceptions, has been generally handled either by Russian specialists who don't know Armenian Middle Eastern history or by Middle Eastern historians who don't know Russian history. In the second place, it would be very interesting from the point of view of the development of Russian administration, imperial policy, to study just precisely what privileges are being granted to Armenian communities and what role they fulfill in Russian social development, particularly Russia's commercial ventures. And then in the Soviet period, the peculiar role which Armenians are performing in the Caucasus. I cannot go into details here, but the whole development of Armenia since the 19th century is very interesting and has great significance to the Soviet specialists. This, in general, then are the links which bind Russian history to Armenian history, which make the founding of an Armenian charity very important for a Russian historian as well. Having said this, I'd like to now draw a bit on the experience of Russian studies at Harvard to indicate what might possibly happen to Armenian studies here. As you know, Russian studies today are a very big business at Harvard. We have a large Russian research center with something like 50 members in it. We have a Russian regional studies program with some 30 students. And we have Russian specialists, both in the Russian concentrators in the college, and Russian specialists in virtually every major department of the humanities and social sciences at Harvard. Thus, there are those who are taking their degrees in economics or in politics who specialize in Russian affairs. In history alone, there are at this moment, I believe, 22 or 23 doctoral candidates in Russian history. Now, all this had its humble beginnings roughly 50 years ago, when Professor Archibald Kulic, the professor of modern European history, began also to be interested in Russian history and offered in his course, and what was then called Northern European History, some lectures on Russia. It was only in the 1920s that Professor Lord, later Father Lord, was appointed to a chair which dealt with Poland and Russia. And Professor Karpovich was really the very first strictly Russian specialist. And he came to Harvard in the late 1920s. But even Professor Karpovich in the 1930s had only a few students. But with from these humble beginnings, they developed, during and particularly after the war, a tremendous interest in Russian studies, leading to its present dimension. Now, I'm not implying or suggesting that this would happen to the Armenian studies, or that it would be desirable to happen to Armenian studies. After all, Russia is a gigantic country with some 2 million inhabitants, and it would be inconceivable that one would have hundreds of students studying Armenian here. What is important, I think, is this from the point of view of Armenian interests, that by having an Armenian specialist here, in the first place, one would have, the Armenian community would have an authoritative sort of representative of Armenian cultural and scholarly traditions who could speak with authority. In the second place, one would have a man who could train specialists. Now, there wouldn't be many specialists. You don't want to have many specialists from the purely pragmatic point of view. There just aren't enough jobs for people who are primarily trained in Armenian. But it's the third function that I think is perhaps most important. And that is, by having an Armenian specialist here, it makes it possible for people who specialize, in the first place in Armenian, in Middle Eastern studies, and then in studies of adjoining areas, to also obtain training in Armenian language and literature and history. Thus, it is conceivable that a person entering Middle East studies for the purpose of obtaining a degree that's a specialty in Arabic or Persian or Turkish may also take as a second language Armenian. And thus, Armenian then comes into this sort of general stream of historical studies. And this, to my mind, from a purely practical point of view, would be the most important long-range effect of establishing a chair.
Thank you, Professor Pike. I would like to add Sir Hamilton Gibb to say a few words.
The gentlemen who have just been speaking to you have, I think, really preempted the field. They have told you what functions Armenians, what the necessities are, what the needs of scholarship are in Armenian studies. They have told you how a professor is appointed. They have told you what is going on in Armenian studies, the kind of level to which we have to try and build up these studies. And Professor Pipes has given you an idea of the general sort of program with which we may hope to begin the work in Armenian studies. Now, in a sense, without perhaps, I may perhaps be seeming to presume too much, but in a sense, this comes back to me. All of these things. After all, Armenian studies, in the first instance, will have to be developed within the general area of Middle Eastern studies. And it is part of the task of those who are responsible for the administration of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies to look at the field as a whole, to be constantly planning. Here is what we have. What ought we to have? What ought we to be doing in addition to what we are? And of course, what we ought we to be doing involves a number of questions. And obviously, one of the questions which is fundamental in such a planning scheme is what kind of facilities are we likely to have at our disposal for developing the work in some of these fields in which we ought to be doing work and in which at the present moment we are not doing more than a certain very limited basic amount of elementary work. And this clearly applies
to the whole field of Armenian studies. We have, so to speak, a flag. Needless to say, this is not a complete flag. We are not specialists in Armenian studies, but we see the problems of the Middle East as a whole. And incidentally, although the Center for Middle Eastern Studies is primarily devoted to the study of the preparation of students in the modern world, nevertheless, we still think ourselves that Middle Eastern studies involve everything in the Middle East, from the Paleolithic age to the Mesolithic age to the Neolithic age, and the proto-historic and the historic age, right down to this moment. And so, therefore, we see Armenian studies in the context, in a very broad context indeed. The context of ancient Armenia, a context of medieval Armenia, and the context of modern Armenia, and the Armenian people. The dispersion of Armenian communities throughout the Middle East itself and outside the boundaries of the Middle East. The economic relations of Armenia as a region and of Armenian communities as communities with their neighbors and with and clearly, someday, for a long time, we've been hoping someday that we are going to be able to initiate a program of work in some of these areas. Now, it's quite obvious, especially after what Dr. Sanjian has said, that one person or two persons or even five persons is not going to be able to comprise the complete scope of Armenian studies over all these periods of time and all these areas, all these branches of study. But we have, so to speak, a kind of picture before us as to what we should like to see done. And the important thing is to get a start made, and this is what you have made possible for us. And this is why we are, and will always continue to be, immensely grateful to those who organized NAASR and to those who have contributed to NAASR to make this possible. What actually will be done within the next measurable period of years, let's say 5 years, let's say 10 years, what actually will be done, of course, will depend essentially upon the men who are going to be working in this field within the university. Now, Dean Jones has already indicated that, of course, the decision as to who the men are is not going to be made by the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. It's not going to be made by any group of professors within the university. It's going to be made ultimately at the higher ranges of the administration. But there's one very important factor that comes into it. And it is this, that there is in Harvard, in every branch of studies, a clear conception of the standard which its professors are expected to reach and to maintain. Now this, you may say, is surely something that is natural, inevitable, general. It isn't so. This is not so, unfortunately. There are very few institutions in the world, and not all of them are in America by any means, in which there is a knowledge of what kind of standard a professor of Armenian should represent. What is meant by scholarship in Armenian studies? What is meant by scholarship in Armenian history? What is meant by scholarship in art, in Armenian art and archaeology? Now there are lots of amateurs. You can pick up amateurs. I live almost everywhere. But we must have the profession. And you have to have standards, and you have to have people who know how to apply standards in order to be sure that you get it. But there's little more than this. So there's a little more than this to this particular problem of Armenian studies. To be sure, we must have the professional. We must have the man who, whatever his branch of Armenian studies is, nevertheless at least professional in the matter of language, classical Armenian, modern Armenian, is also a professional in some kind of application of those linguistic materials to some branch of humanistic or social science, or humanistic studies or social science. Because, as you know, as we know, this chair is not a chair for Harvard alone. It is, and we are aware of this fact, this is a chair which, for the time being, stands for Armenian studies in the United States of America. And so, what we hope, what we aim at, is someone who, besides being the professional in his own field, is not solely a study-bound, chair-bound professional. Someone who will be able to represent Armenian studies at the highest level of academic competence in such a way that he will contribute, as you have contributed on your side, he will contribute to building up a tradition of Armenian studies here in the first instance at Harvard, which nevertheless can radiate from Harvard and serve as the foundation for the development of similar teaching posts in other universities. Now this puts a tremendous strain, obviously, upon the administration. The necessity of choosing the man who is going to mediate between these two functions. The function of pure scholarship, the man who is a good man in his study and in his library. And at the same time, the function of developing Armenian studies within the university in such a way that they will radiate outside, within the university and outside the university, without being at the same time pure a purpose. We don't want Madison Avenue type. But nevertheless, the man has got to have something Madison Avenue in it. This is what I'm really getting at. And this is difficult because, as I said, there are standards, and whatever happens, the university, no department of the university is going to relax the standards which it requires for its professional teachers. Whatever happens. If Madison Avenue has to go, well, let it go. But we hope, as I say, that it will be possible somehow or another to combine, to mediate between the two major functions which this chair is aiming at carrying out. And now let me just say, we have been talking as if all this was a nice idea. The chair should do this, the chair should do that, the holder of the chair shall be such and such. Let me add one word. We are active. That is to say, this process, which as Dean Jones has said is a long, sometimes a difficult process, the process is already at work. That is already, the search has begun, the investigation of what is being done in Armenian studies, who are doing Armenian studies, what the standards of the work are in various institutions, what kind of fields are being studied in different institutions. This is already on foot. And it's a matter, I don't think, to be a matter of much more than a month before the next stages will begin, the next wheel will begin to turn, at which the university will set up a committee in order to draw recommendations as to the filling of this chair. It may be, of course, we are now already getting on to November. It may be that committees may begin to function, let us say, in the spring. It may be that the university may be in a position to make an appointment even before next summer. I hope so, but I cannot say. But nevertheless, remember, it may not always be possible for the actual nominated professor to start work as early as next September. That is, supposing the university decides that X in a certain position is the right person to do this job, it may very well be the case, of course, that X cannot immediately come to Harvard. If that is so, one thing I think I can say to you with some confidence, nevertheless, the continuing work which has already been begun in Harvard within Armenian studies will continue on and as possibly be developed from its present level, so that when the professor actually does come and takes over, he will find a basic organization of Armenian studies already in existence. He will not have to create from zero. He will find that there are students already interested in Armenian. He will find that there are students who have already done some Armenian. He will find that there are students who are waiting for him to work in the particular field of his competence. This means, obviously, that when work starts, it will start with special reference to the particular field of the professor's own, his own study. If he's a historian, it will start with Armenian physics in this vein. If he's an art specialist, it will start with Armenian art and archaeology in this vein. It will not cover, and cannot cover in the first instance, the whole field of Armenian study. But we hope that this is the beginning. We hope that students will gradually come in the way which the affairs is indicated for Russian, and as happens also with our other Middle Eastern fields. The students gradually come forward, students diversify, they develop their own ranges of specialization, and when the time comes, and if they are fortunate and are able to find academic posts in other universities and colleges, this range of specializations will gradually broaden out. This is what we're aiming at. Heaven forbid that Armenian studies should be limited for the next generation to one university, even if that university is Harvard. We will not, in fact, have really done the job which you have entrusted to us to do, and the job which we ourselves want to do, unless within that generation Armenian studies are represented at perhaps not a score, but let's say at least half a dozen other centers in the United States, by students who have been trained, if possible, certainly inspired by what has been done here.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton Gibb. I had a long list of questions that I had made up, and which many of you kindly fed me to feed on to these Harvard professors. And I very gleefully felt that I could finally catch some Harvard professors and embarrass them, because I was a year student many years, and they embarrassed me constantly by asking me questions year after year. They never asked me short questions. They always wanted me to sit down and write them for 3 hours. When I ask them questions, I always want to find an easy way out. Well, I'll tell you one thing. I think they have done a great job and have answered every question I drew up. So I give them all A for the day. However, we have such a nice audience, and everyone's so been kind and attentive, and the discussion has been so interesting. If you folks are willing, we will continue it a little longer, and perhaps we might ask ourselves a few questions. Some of the panel members might ask another panel member a question, and we might broaden the field a little bit, and then we'll ask a few questions from the floor, and then we'll call it an evening. Does any member of the panel have something that might cast further light on this, or might cast the panel? Another panel. Well, if not, I have one that I might ask, and I'll read that. How can the National Association of Armenian Studies and Research cooperate further with the Harvard Chair? And in what area can we help the chair further? Would anyone here like to elucidate on that? Dr. Frye?
Since I was in on this from the beginning, and Manu, when did we start this? Do you remember? Well, when I was cleaning out my desk today, I found a letter dated 1950, in which I wrote a letter to the provost, Dean Buck, together with another member of the faculty, about doing something about Armenian studies in Harvard. So 4 years before I was working on this. And we've had our ups and downs. I remember, it must have been 1955 then or so, when we had a meeting in Boston. And I got some brickbats from the floor, and I caught them and threw them back. Somebody asked me, "Aha, you're working for a chair for yourself or something." No, I tell you, NAASR can still do a very great deal. Number one, as Professor Gibb has told you, it's not simply a matter of Harvard. It is a national problem, and really just beginning. But he also emphasized the fact, which I should like to re-emphasize, that a professor, a man in a chair, cannot possibly cover the whole field. I mean, the field is so vast, a great deal of work is needed, and furthermore, he will require assistance. Anybody who has ever occupied a lone chair knows what this means. I had a friend who occupied a chair in a language, an Oriental language, for many years at Harvard. He told me when many years ago I started into this field, he said, "Take heed, yours will be a lonely path." I think it is one great failing in American education, as contrasted with Europe, as I've had occasion to see in the past year, that American education, higher education in the universities, is not primarily or has not concerned itself with what the Germans called Nachwuchs, the succession of a continuity of traditions. As you know well, as you should know well, the history of higher education in this country is is characterized by the hiring of people from abroad, and when they go hiring more, simply because no care, no concern has been taken for the continuity, not just of the students, but for these students to continue in their chosen fields and do work. This is all right in atomic physics. No one needs to worry about that. But in Armenian studies, Iranian, Turkish, such studies, it is not only necessary, it has to be looked after specially. It cannot be assumed that everything is going to be taken care of because you have one man there appointed to a professorial post. And I think that the conception of studies as such implies a center, a seminar, if you will, a person who is able to gather people about him, and not just students, but also people who are advanced in research and who will be able to continue their work and continue what they have set upon their life's work. So I think that as far as NAASR's contribution, continuing contribution, there are many, many ways in which the give and take can be carried out. The question of books also, the question of distribution of books, building up of libraries, building up of a center of information, if you will. A tradition, the very creation of a tradition requires a great deal of nourishing and care. So the task has really only just begun.
Thank you, Dr. Frye. I'd like to say that personally, I can really vouch for Dr. Frye. Now, he doesn't know this, but I know a lot more about him than he thinks I know. I happen to know that I'll tell you a little story. That when I came back from the service in 1946, my mother had passed away, and the family home had been sold. I was overseas 2 years, and I came back, and I'd been married, so I was living in my wife's apartment with her family until I found a home of my own. It was a very small apartment, and there was one living room in it. And the last assignment I had when I came back was the Fort Devils, and I'd come back every night. And who should be parked in the living room studying Armenian but Dr. Frye? The late Dr. Barsagian was my wife's father, and he was teaching him Armenian. And I was very surprised to see an Anglo-Saxon stock, a fellow of Anglo-Saxon stock, busy studying Armenian. I said, gee, I wonder if this fellow will really take this seriously and never amount to anything. Did you know that I was at GI? I was sitting in the kitchen when you were studying Armenian?
It just shows you what a small world it is. Well, you put on a few white hair or something.
I have. That was about 15 years ago, wasn't it?
Sounds like this is your life.
Here's life. Well, it's been a very, very enlightening discussion. I'm sure we have a few minutes for a question or two from the floor. Now, any latecomer asks a question that's already been answered. I think we ought to turn it down. Yes. Certainly.
I will use the commercial that Dr. Frye started with his book. As chairman of the library committee, anyone who has these books knows about these books to be disposed of. I'll be glad to accept them. He has a problem.
Well, thank you, Mr. Evans. That was Mr. Thomason Mary. Tom, will you please stand up and give us your address? If there are any other questions from the floor, I'll be willing to present to the panel at this time. Yes.
How could NAASR be developed into an international organization? Could it be possible to do that?
The question is, could it be possible to develop NAASR into an international organization? Somebody here would like to try to answer that?
Well, that should be answered from somebody on the floor, I think. You know.
I think he is indicating Manog Young. Manog, would you kindly see if you could give an answer to that?
Well, I think that NAASR is already an international organization because we do have, I think, about 10 members outside of the North American continent. We have quite a few in Canada, and we have some in Europe and some in the Near East. And I think as time goes along, as our work progresses, and as Harvard comes forth with this program in a more active way, we'll have a lot more interest created, the international relationships established more closely in this field of Armenian studies. And I know that in the works there is the plan to have a committee which will pursue relationship with groups outside of the United States who are interested in furthering Armenian studies. But this is in the plan. It will take a while to get underway.
Thank you, Mr. Young. There was another question here somewhere in the floor.
What else would be honest? Any prospective members will be glad to sign on.
Would you please repeat? Oh, all right. If there are any prospective members, we'd like to sign them up after the meeting outside during the refreshment period. Question?
I want to direct a question to Sir Hamilton Gibb. You indicated the three-pronged approach that a given professor would have to follow, namely one of interesting other universities in this country in Armenian studies, another of his own research, whatever specialty that may be. Dr. Piper has indicated that other centers, that other disciplines in the Near East group would also borrow him and ask him either to teach or to provide some of his time. I wonder just how much of this man's time we could subdivide. What controls do we have?
Well, it looks as if we have to add another qualification. to the professor, I think, doesn't it? That he must be a man of sufficient strength of mind to impose his own control.
Thank you, Sir Hamilton.